Welcome to Revolutionizing Activism, the Power of Utopia. With each event in this series, we love to bring really dynamic minds to talk about some of the guiding principles in their own work. And with Utopia today, we're really excited to talk about how everyone's work articulates and plays with the idea of utopia in similar and distinct ways. Without further ado, I will now introduce Stuart Candy. Stuart Candy was trained as a lawyer, but dodged a bullet and instead became an artist, designer, and facilitator, working to augment the collective capacity to think ahead. Currently a Berggruen Fellow at the University of Southern California and director of Situation Lab, over the past decade and a half, he has helped transform the future's foresight field through experiential future practices, devising tools, media, and cultural interventions to make possible worlds easier to imagine and discuss in the present. As an educator, he has introduced futures at leading design schools, and as a practitioner, he has partnered with organizations including the UN agencies, the BBC, International Red Cross, Oxford University, and many others. Stuart is co-editor of Design and Futures and co-creator of the award-winning imagination game, The Thing from the Future. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Stuart.
Thank you so much, Mariam, and thanks to the Center for Artistic Activism for having us today. So the pleasure falls to me to introduce our panelists today. As far as I can tell, we may be a panelist short, but hopefully he'll be along in just a moment. But so the two panelists for today's topic, the power of utopia, Terry Marshall and Cory Doctorow. Terry Marshall is co-founder and creative director of Intelligent Mischief. He's an artist, strategist, and cultural studies scholar living in Brooklyn by way of Barbados and Boston. He has 20 plus years of experience as a labor and cultural organizer and previously founded the Hip Hop Media Lab and Streets is Watching. He's currently a senior fellow at the USC Annenberg Innovation Lab Civic Media Fellowship and an alum of the LAT Project Creative Change Fellowship. Terry loves movies and comics and is a Walking Dead superfan.
Okay, we can get started with Terry, who Stuart has already introduced. So Terry, if you could get started with your presentation. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to come speak. Cool. Thank everyone. Thank you, C4A, for having me. Thank you for coming. My name is Terry Marshall. I'm the Executive Creative Director of Intelligent Mischief and also founder. Intelligent Mischief, our tagline is Unleashing Black Imagination to Shape the Future. We are a creative studio / design lab. Quickly go through, why is that not working? Okay, I'll quickly go through what we do and then go into our concepts of why using utopia, or what we specifically go into Black utopia, is good for organizing and social justice and social change in the world. Creative Studio, we do multi-platform world building, multi-platform world storytelling through collective imagining and cultural strategy consulting. So one way that works out is that we produce our own, what we call products, right? Products where we use the technique of world building to produce, like, it could be a film, it could be a podcast, any kind of cultural product to put out in the world of what we like to consider part of a narrative strategy shift for social change, social justice. And we also then consult grassroots organizations on using world building and particularly utopia as a guiding framework for visioning and strengthening their own vision for the world they want to see it change, and how that goes to strengthening their strategy and tactics. So we come up with a quick definition of a Black utopia, right? And we consider Black utopia, we specifically deal working with Black folks, people all throughout the African diaspora. And we see that the Black imagination, the radical Black imagination, has always been a source of liberation and change for Black folks throughout. And and particularly within that utopia, we see as an important roadmap, an important guide to get to where we want to go. You can have all the plans you want, but if you don't have a vision for where you're going, then your strategy and tactics, I think, are not going to be very useful, right? And that's what we ground our work in. So we consider this is our definition we came up with of a Black utopia as collective power, love, repair, restoration. This is what makes up the parts. We consider what has been throughout the history of Black struggles of resistance, where people have envisioned kind of Black utopias. And they usually start with liberated zones, reimagine places, decolonize spaces, land, staying power, reimagine spirit and story, Afro-Indigenous, ancestral, who we are and what we mean to the world. Black bodies are sacred. Reimagine systems and structures, transform culture, governance, and economies. We own it, we control it together. Reimagine values and ways of being together. Black love, Black joy, Black rest, Black time, right? What's this have? Okay, I'm just clicking slow. And when we usually, the forms we see throughout like history of Black utopias that have been actualized, right, and envisioned have come from largely liberated zones, or liberated zones which have come either through struggles, could be nonviolent civil disobedience struggles, could have been armed struggles, it could be slave rebellions, many different forms, right? Even temporary, people used to call them temporary autonomous zones, but temporary spaces that people have created for themselves, like even on the dance floor, right? We consider all these things various levels of liberated zones. And we take this definition of liberated zone from Ed Whitfield, who is an elder and a leader in the reparations movement throughout the African diaspora. Said, but in order to hope for the master's house to burn, a field Negro would have to have a view, a vision, or alternative, someplace to go so that we don't simply perish in the flames. We will have to have an image of freedom that is clear enough in our minds to guide our thinking and dreaming. Robin D.G. Kelley, in his book, Freedom Dreams, outlines the importance of such vision. He points out that the Black freedom struggle has always had freedom dreams. I heard my friend, the poet and educator Haki Madhubuti, say in speech once, that we are good at expressing our oppression narrative, but what is our freedom narrative? We spend so much time talking about what we can't do and what is hurting and what the man won't let us do, that many of us have stopped even dreaming about what we want and what we can do and what we can and must build, what we are able to provide. And we just use that because we like to talk about, this is the point of utopias, right? And having a roadmap. Because a lot of us, like it says in there, I think the key line is like, a lot of us are good at our oppression narrative, or like, what's the problem now? And a lot of times our movements struggle with the developing, expressing the vision that we want, right? So we go into like, okay, that's what we think is a usefulness of having utopia, a usefulness of having a roadmap, a vision, where to go. We particularly, in our methodology, we use world building to help people map out their guidance to you. World building, really, and many people may know this, but we always put it out, is a literary framing device used by fiction writers to create context for system, reality, storytelling. It includes defining history, laws, nature, geography, ecology, and culture, myth, values, laws, etc., within which stories take place. It can be an important tool for vision and creating narratives that guide activism strategy. Through world building, we can vividly imagine the worlds we are trying to make real, invite others to co-create through culture, policy, prefigurative institution building, and more, right? These are some of the things that we think world building helps creates alignment around cultural shift, imagines transform reality, creates new forms of organizing social activism, imagines further than current limitations. And that's really the whole point of this, right? It was like, why don't we just use a regular strategy tool? And we feel like there's something more that we need to get to. We need to get a larger vision, and that doesn't just come from like, I just want to say X's and O's, right? Like, how do you actually dream? And this is where we go back to like actually Robert D.G. Kelley's book, Freedom Dreams, and what is freedom dreaming, right? And how that's actually important to the concrete work and that we engage in, whether that's like voting rights, whether it's around immigration struggles or LGBTQ rights, and so on and so forth, right? And we often give, we give some examples of like historical movements that we feel have used world building, like abolitionist movement. A lot of abolitionist movement went into describing just a world where there was not human beings in bondage, right? And after having experience of working in a system like that for a couple hundred years, that starts to become a utopia, right? If you had like people who've been enslaved for 200 years and you told them like, this could be a world where, we don't have to enslave people. We don't have to think people are inferior color of their skin and so on and so forth, that we could all benefit from that, right? You're describing a utopia to people who've been like, no, this is the way it's been, this way it has to be. W. Du Bois wrote a lot of science fiction, something that he was not really known about, but we love digging into like W. Du Bois science fiction and the things that he wrote out, that I think he felt that science fiction, the stories and narratives could describe a better world to people than just like economics and being an economist or showing numbers. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech speaks for itself. Like that, just having a vision. Sometimes people say it's like, oh, it's one of his like weaker speeches, but the why it's so popular is because it offered a vision, a hope, a roadmap. I'll speed through some more of these. So what we usually do when we work with groups, right, we do something called Black Utopias Design Lab. And this will do visioning through world building, strategy through storytelling, and prototyping through experience design and art creation. So we take people through this methodology of world building, and then we actually have them, once they've crafted this world, we ask them, okay, now develop an artifact, create something in that world, right? Which is like a diegetic prototype, something that you've imagined, and create a prototype and make it real. And then he's like, can you bring that to the present world? And can that help you in your struggles of today? So now I'm gonna go give 2 examples of world building that we did. Our first example is a product that we created, a world called Nation X. And the second example is gonna just be showing some clips of what we do in the design lab, in our dream labs, to help organizations develop artifacts and strengthen their strategy. So Nation X is a multimedia experience that we've developed for the last 2 years. We did it for 1 day, 24 hours in 2020, and it was an online platform. And Nation X is this world we've been developing for 5 years. Nation X is a maroon society that's lasted for past 400 years or 500 years, that's Afro-Indigenous, is in the Caribbean, is hidden by waterfalls, and they've been trying to free people throughout the African diaspora since that time. And they currently, their agents always change to adapt to the times, and the current agents that go out in Nation X disguise themselves as DJs. So we did an online 24-hour party where people come in, they get information and try to enter the world of Nation X. When we did the online party, we documented where people was listening to us. I think we had a couple of thousand people, and it was like in South Africa, people, United Kingdom, Brazil. We had no idea. We have no idea how we got all these people out here. We just thought, we'd be in the old US, but we were like pleasantly surprised the different spots where people were tuning in live and interacting with each other. There was a mode where there was a feature where you could interact with people inside, whether it was an online club that people could go into, and people were interacting with live people on Zoom who were playing characters in the story. In Nation X has a flag. We did many of the world building. We developed characters. We developed a mythology. We developed a system of governance. We're hoping to make Nation X human, I forget the words, but live interaction experience sometime later this year with the help with some other comrades. So this is the flag of Nation X. This is a machete chopping the chains. They broke from slavery. This is the characters that was developed for Nation X, the Brew Hexes. They don't work for the government. They share the same system values as the government, but they disagree. They think the government's too conservative in trying to free Black people. And so they kind of rebelliously go on their own, and agents encounter the Brew Hexes, who is an all-femme collective, where they have some disagreements, but then they have to also work together to achieve the same goals. This is the island map of Nation X. It's about the size of Australia. And yeah, there's different, we have a much more detailed map too going there, right? So I wanted to show that, just to give a quick example of like, that's something we produce, and we hope to create a comic book. We hope to do live experiences, hope to do all these other things. And we consider this part of a narrative strategy of just like making it normalized of like, what's your dream world? What's the dream society of Nation X is like? What happens there? What's the rituals? And can we put people in those experiences? And if they experience that, then they could also act it out directly. Man, I have 1 minute left. I don't know how long that minute ago was, but I'll just cut. The second part is we worked with the Black Freedom Coalition, which is a statewide coalition in New York State, that they was developing a policy agenda to take forth. They asked us to work with them to develop how could they expand their imagination for what they want to demand, and we put them through the dream lab. And so, usually a dream lab, we just have people playing this. That's all I'll give you from it. People go through that, and then we show some clips. And we show all this, right? I'll stop there. We show all that to just demonstrate, to get people relaxed and also get them in the mindset of actually dreaming, right? And through this, we help them go through, and I can't show you the whole process, but we help them go through this process where they had to expand their imagination for the demands that they developed and went into the policy demands of the state. And I'll stop there because I don't know how long I went over. I so apologize for that.
No worries at all. Terry, thank you so much. Fantastic. Yeah, this is a good visual way of applauding on Zoom, I find, in case you haven't come across that before. But yeah, brilliant start. And apologies for the hiccup. We're Christopher Nolaning this, so it's going to go in a totally different order from expected. Thank you very much, Terry Marshall from Intelligent Mischief. And folks, some of you have started posting questions in the chat. Please keep those coming. We'll be kind of making a repository of those to come to after the presentation portions. And yeah, I got kicked off there. I thought it might have been David Hasselhoff, Zoom bombing us to give us a big thumbs up for the all-male panel that we have here. Totally kidding. Very, very exciting, very exciting panelists we have here. I'm going to finish introducing Cory Doctorow before his presentation, but I think maybe what I'll do, because I was asked to say a little bit about my practice and kind of set up our topic here slightly. So let me see if I can share my screen. If the hosts can enable me in that endeavor, that would be brilliant. And yeah, I mean, as you know, the topic here is the power of utopia. So we have this concept of utopia, which Terry's presentation touched on in a couple of really key ways. And I'll come at it. I have a slightly shorter presentation. Come at it in a number of other ways through each of our practices. But so the term, and this is probably familiar to many folks on the call, but it comes from this book, over 500 years old, Thomas More's Utopia, and etymologically it means no place. So when Terry was talking about the utopia of an abolitionist society from within a slaveholding society, he was referring to the almost unimaginably good conditions of a society to strive for. And that's kind of the core idea here that we're exploring the power of as an activist gesture and resource. And this is a shot from the from that first edition of Utopia with the map of Utopia, that all-important map that Oscar Wilde refers to. You need the map that includes Utopia and the alphabet in Latin. But so I'm spending this year at the University of Southern California, and quite a bit of that time at the School of Cinematic Arts, which is a bit of a weird place. That's the George Lucas building on the left and the Steven Spielberg building on the right. But my longtime collaborator and much missed friend Jeff Watson, with whom I ran Situation Lab for almost a decade, pointed this out to me, that there's over the archway, there's this inscription in Latin. So this could have appeared in Utopia perhaps, Limes Regiones Rerum, which translates as, and actually Jeff Watson used this as the title for his doctoral work, reality ends here. Reality ends here. Sort of an interesting gesture to what we're talking about when we're talking about trying to cross those thresholds into other imaginable worlds. But realities, don't just end and begin at the threshold of the cinema school at USC. Realities are constantly ending and beginning and morphing, at the scale of a room. I mean, we've all been in those situations where, suddenly the power shifts, or somebody enters a room, or you enter a room and the rules are different. The culture of even a space that small is somehow maybe different from what you expected. And so this idea of the possibilities of exploration of different worlds at the scale of the room is something that my colleagues and students and collaborators and I have been working on for over a decade. We have this design brief called the Time Machine, where the idea is to take a scenario from the page and turn it into an experience that you can have at the scale of a room. And so you walk into this room and you are inhabiting a version of the year 2050 or 2070 or 2035 or whatever it may be. And it can cover all sorts of topics, all sorts of questions, all sorts of provocations about, in this case, the futures of adoption in Ontario, or the futures of climate impact on society, or how government services are rendered. All manner of topics are explorable and sort of investigable in that way. And it's of course, because it's a huge design space, right? We're talking about not just all possible futures, and whether they're shaped like this or not doesn't really matter, but imagine that each of these kind of uncountable dots in the possibility space is a different world. And then we're taking as our menu of possible things to bring to life all the rooms that exist in each of those possible worlds. So there's a lot to choose from here. And some are exciting, some are melancholy, some are provocative, some are frankly downright baffling. There's a lot of weird futures out there. And this work goes back to stuff that my colleague, longtime collaborator, Jake Dunnigan, now at Institute for the Future, and I did back in Hawaii about 16, 17 years ago now, where we put 550 people into 4 different versions of the year 2050 with our colleagues from the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies to provide a basis for a conversation about Hawaii's sustainability plans, which it didn't have any of at that time. But bringing people into a room that you've set up for that purpose is just one kind of arrangement, right? And so we're here to talk about activism, which also means being willing to bring ideas to people on an unsolicited basis when they're not necessarily asking for it or registering for it or signing up. What about when you bring the futures to them? And so this space, at least in our practice, guerrilla futures, which is kind of in the overlapping space between strategic foresight, ways of systematically exploring possible futures, and tactical media, that kind of activism that is temporary, opportunistic, and engages in the critique of the dominant order. And so there's a whole bunch of approaches to doing this, and I'll just sort of flash through a few of them so you can see what I mean. After Hawaii 2050, we started putting objects from those futures out in the world for people to stumble across, just to sort of see what it felt like. And we created postcards from different futures, initially for a workshop, a scripted space, but then ended up sending hundreds of them to people all around the state of Hawaii to their home addresses without any explanation or return address as kind of provocations to encounter over the kitchen table. We started installing fragments of possible futures for a neighborhood in the neighborhood itself. And so each of these explorations is a different way of asking what if, what might happen in this case in Honolulu's Chinatown, based on completely different hypotheses about what change might bring, in this case, a pandemic, which we brought to life in 2007 and was set hypothetically in 2017. And so, you can also do this in semi-permission-based ways, like the panel at South by Southwest that we did in 2008 with Michelle Bowman, Wayne Petherick, and Jemay Cascio, bringing to life a series of futures. People thought they were coming to see a panel conversation. In fact, the first thing they were treated to was a eulogy for Dirk Diggler from the movie Boogie Nights, recounting the rest of his story through to the year 2025, becoming a copy fight hero, resisting the encroachment of intellectual property law into every aspect of our lives and bodies. Or this project a few years later with some of my students from OCAD in Toronto, where we brought to life a hypothetical product as if it were real and launched it at Canada's biggest architecture and interior design trade show. So again, kind of slightly permission-based, as in the organizers knew what we were doing, but the tens of thousands of people who were at the event didn't know that this was a hypothetical. They were approaching it as real. And then there's more participatory processes like this design jam that we ran at the Museum of Tomorrow in Rio de Janeiro, whereby using this game that Jeff and I designed, The Thing from the Future, people created posters from various futures for Rio, and then went outside, this is all in one day, went outside, installed them in the streets, documented them, and then brought them back to sort of show this series of, I guess, temporary autonomous zones that they had created with fragments of futures overlaid on the present. Or this project, which my students formerly at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago did against the backdrop of the 2016 presidential election. They created an organization just after the election, the 2016 election. They created an organization called Can Assist and went out into the streets to help people who may have wanted to emigrate to Canada. Now, the purpose actually was to have a conversation about what is it about Canada that is so idealized that you would want to move there, and how can you bring that to life in your community right now? So another mechanism for looping the preferred future back into present day action. Or this project, which is for the International Red Cross, where together with colleagues from Changeist and Superflux, who created artifacts from the future to put in the lobby area of the big every 2 years meeting that 1,000 people from the Red Cross, Red Crescent organizations around the world have, we created guerrilla artifacts to install on the back of toilet stalls, for example, at the conference venue. This is not necessarily utopian, but it is a provocation of sorts. Or this to put on cash registers throughout the facility. Or this, some of them maybe are a little more aspirational, like this poster from a climate migrants movement emerging in different language communities and political communities all over the world, and building bonds across those divides that traditionally would have been impossible to create solidarity across by dint of linguistic and cultural separation. Maybe looking forward, this is the kind of solidarity that we could imagine. Or this artifact, which was designed to slip under people's hotel room doors at that event. It's an invitation to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in 2029 for the Global Red Cross and Red Crescent Network, which is, again, a kind of utopian imagining of what the Red Cross, Red Crescent Network could look like if it were more geared around foresight and anticipation and prevention of humanitarian crises than response, or in addition to response. Or this project, which again, this one was with Jake and Civic.io and Institute for the Future, where we taught over a series of engagements about 100 mayors from across the United States, all geographies and political persuasions, to think about futures using a special cities edition of the game, The Thing from the Future, and then together with artist partners created posters from preferred futures articulated by those mayors. So these are fragments of the cities that those mayors would like to see their cities become: Santa Fe, Anaheim, Austin, Texas, and many others. Well, this project, which I won't explain in detail, but is an intervention from last year that was commissioned by the United Nations Development Program to kick off their annual innovation event with a conversation about what could the future landscape of global development look like. And so I spoke with each of the panelists ahead of time, created artifacts inspired by what they told me, sent them to the panelists. So before the event, nobody knew what anybody else was going to receive before the event. Then they introduced themselves in a Zoom conversation like this through the vector of, or through the portal of the tangibilization of these ideas. So a world where corporations can be executed for crimes like ecocide, or a world where animals are consulted on urban development processes, or a world where multilateral organizations model their activities after indigenous culture and cultural and governance practices, or a world where social media platforms like Twitter are actually owned by their users rather than someone like Elon Musk, or a world where ancestors' assemblies are regularly convened to assess proposed legislation in terms of its impact on future generations. So each of these is a fragment of a preferred future as evoked by those interlocutors in conversation. And then to finish, two of my favorite utopian interventions that I've ever come across, wasn't involved in these, but love them. One is by the Yes Men and Steve Lambert, co-founder of the very organization that brings us together today, the New York Times Special Edition, which is a really wonderful distillation of a kind of progressive political wish list distilled into the format of the newspaper of record and distributed to tens of thousands of people physically in their hands in 2008, but set in 2009. Or this project, which is too little known and too multifaceted to describe properly in brief, but 16 juin 2014 is 16th of June 2014. It's an amazing project that was run, actually, of all people, by advertisers in the midst of the Arab Spring, after the dictator of Tunisia, Ben Ali, was ousted, and things were uncertain for a period, as to whether because the revolutionaries hadn't expected to succeed as wildly as they did. This project entailed imagining and basically LARPing collectively on a whole lot of different media channels, including social media, newspapers, and television, pretending that it was 3 years and 3 months into the future. So this took place in February 2011, but it is set in June 2014, and it imagined a Tunisia where that was prospering and thriving. And by the end of the day, that had ended it had transformed the conversation internally within the country, but also begun to gain international attention too. So this sort of flyby of different approaches, I think, leads me to some questions, and I'm not going to ask these as direct questions right now, but sort of just seed them for our future conversation. What's the importance or role of utopias versus other kinds of imaginaries? So how does the idea of a utopia sit alongside the other kinds of futures or the other kinds of thinking that we could and perhaps should be doing? And when evoking utopia, whose do we mean is another question. So, because of course, one person's utopia may not be that for someone else. So, in service of whom and how are we designating these things? So, all right, that's my kind of interlude between our two presenters. Cory Doctorow is our second presenter, and I think I was booted off the Wi-Fi just as I was about to say that he's the author of many books, most recently Attack Surface, and his next nonfiction book is Choke Point Capitalism with Rebecca Giblin. Cory, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to hear the other two presentations. Whenever we talk about utopia or dystopia, inevitably the subject of whether one or the other is optimistic or pessimistic crops up. And I am foursquare against optimism and pessimism. I think they're both a form of fatalism, in that both of them take the position that no matter what we do, something will happen. Things will be fine. Things won't be fine. And if you think things are going to be fine, or you think things won't be fine, irrespective of what we do as people, then there's no reason to get out of bed, right? If history is on rails and we can't steer it, then that is genuinely fatalistic. It's the kind of thing where science fiction writers who mistake themselves for like latter-day Nostradamus, who've been like just taking too much of their own product, they often say, you know, like, I can predict the future. And there's really nothing more cynical than the idea that you can predict the future, and also less ambitious, because, you know, changing the future is a lot more ambitious than predicting the future. So I like to think of where we're at right now in terms of our multiple looming wicked crises, climate, economics, war, and so on, as being like prisoners on a bus. And that bus is barreling toward the edge of a cliff. And the thing that is dystopian about that bus is not that it's barreling towards the edge of a cliff, because like the human condition since time immemorial has been barreling towards the edge of a cliff in whatever kind of vehicle we could conceive of, whether that was like a chariot or a bus. The thing that's dystopian is there's a bunch of people who are like, we can't turn the wheel. If we turn the wheel, something bad might happen to the bus. And there's a bunch of us going, but you see the cliff, right? And they're like, you know, we'll probably jump the chasm. And if we can't, maybe while we're in mid-flight, we can build some wings for the bus. I'm sure flying buses will be a possibility by the time we hit that cliff. And so I don't think it's utopian or rather dystopian to say that we're on this bus and that we're heading towards the cliff. I think it's utopian to say we can all rush the driver and yank the wheel, and that maybe the worst that's going to happen is that like some of us will break an arm or a leg. And that's the kind of utopianism that I'm really here for. And it's a utopianism not of optimism, but a utopianism of hope. Hope is the necessary but insufficient precondition for a better tomorrow. And hope is grounded in the idea that what we do can change the future. That, you know, if you think about in computer science, I'm an imaginary computer scientist. I have an honorary degree in computer science, but no formal training in computer science. And in computer science, we have this idea of this thing called the ant, or rather the hill climbing algorithm, in which a computer scientist needs to traverse some really big, gnarly data set. Like, what is the best search result out of a giant database to match your query? And by the time you enumerate all the elements of that data set, the data set will have changed so much that you still won't have an answer. And so you have to arrive at some heuristic, some rule of thumb, to try to find the like close enough for rock and roll, the good enough to answer your query answer to that problem. And so we do this thing called hill climbing. And in hill climbing, it analogizes to the idea of like having an insect, like an ant, that only has front-facing eyes, so it can't look up. And that ant wants to traverse the terrain around it to get to the highest possible ground that it can reach, right? The maximum, the local maximum most closely available to it, the best solution to finding high ground that it can find. And rather than trying to map the terrain, which is not a thing the ant can do, the ant has a rule of thumb, because it has these legs. And it can ask itself which of these legs is on the highest ground. And it can go, okay, I'm just going to take one step in that direction. And when I reach that point, I'm now on new terrain that I couldn't enumerate or understand or predict from when I was at that lower point. So I take that one step, and now I can see or I can sense new pathways to ascend the gradient. This leg is on highest ground now, so I can take one step this way. And now this leg is on highest ground, and I can take one step this way. This is the heuristic of hope, right? It's the idea that if you can't see your way from here to the end, right? If the world is not a novel, which I assure you it is not and cannot be plotted, and it is instead composed of this like unimaginably complex terrain that we can never fully enumerate, that we can never conceive of all the plans and counter plans to go forward into the future. Instead, what you do is you ask yourself, from the paths that I can see around me, which path takes me closest to the goal that I want? And you take that one affirmative step with the hope that when you find yourself in that slightly bettered position, that you will from that position find other ways to go towards the future that you want that you couldn't see from where you were before. When the ship sinks in the middle of the Atlantic, you tread water not because you have a reasonable expectation of being rescued, but because everyone who was ever rescued tread water until the rescue arrived, right? It's the necessary insufficient precondition for the future that we want to arrive at. And so for me, this idea of the swerve, right, that we can rush the driver and yank the wheel and maybe only suffer some broken bones, and then figure out how it is that the driver was allowed to drive us towards the edge of the cliff for so long, and what it was that gripped the psyches of the people we loved and cared about such that they could not conceive of yanking the wheel, and how we kind of bring them along. That is the most utopian vision we can have. So a utopian future is not a future in which we have no problems. A utopian future is a future in which we do something about our problems. And that may sound like it's lacking some dramatic moment. I'm a science fiction writer. I'm a pulp writer, right? Science fiction is a pulp genre. That means that it likes to find where the plot is and lean way hard into it. And, the two pulp plots are what we used to call man versus man and man versus nature, which we can now call humanity versus humanity and humanity versus nature. And, science fiction writers, being a creative and thrifty lot, we like a twofer. So we like man versus nature versus man. The tsunami blows your house down, your neighbors come over and eat you. That makes for a real plot forward story, but it's a very cynical way of doing storytelling. And it's a sin that I was guilty of myself, that kind of lazy storytelling in which we assume that our neighbors are just waiting for the lights to go out to reveal that they've always dreamt of eating us and to come over and devour us. But I had my mind permanently changed when I read Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, her 2012 multi-award winning, incredibly seminal historical book about what happens during crises, where she, as an historian, goes to people who produce contemporaneous accounts of what life was like in the aftermath of disasters that we remember as times in which people turned on each other and revealed the true bestial nature of humanity, starting with the 1906 quake in San Francisco, but moving through Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the Haitian quake, and so on. And what she finds is that in these contemporaneous accounts, we do not see people turning on one another. What we see is this kind of ringing silence following the disaster, in which the background refrigerator hum of petty grievance stops. And in the silence that follows, we can hear our moral sense speaking to us and telling us that our top priority is digging our neighbors out of the rubble. That, when the crisis comes, you don't go over to your neighbor's house with a shotgun. You go over with a covered dish, because all the food in the freezer is going to defrost, and you got to have a big old barbecue, which is literally what people do after these disasters. They share with one another. And I realized that there was so much drama latent, so much plot forward, good pulpy drama latent in stories that took that as the theory of human action. You could write books like my book, Walkaway, whose original title was Utopia. I changed it because Kim Stanley Robinson said this book should surely be called Walkaway. In my book, Walkaway, I have an environmental collapse. I have oligarchy run amok. And I have people who do not surrender and who fight back and who try to build a better society. And this is where the drama comes in. They don't agree. They all agree on what the problem is, and they don't agree on what to do about it. And I tell you, the drama of merely disagreeing with people you dislike and have no respect for is pretty thin compared to the drama of having irreconcilable differences with people you love and respect. Rifts that can never be healed between them. It's one thing to lose an argument at the Christmas table with your family. That's tough. But winning an argument's even worse. because it means that you are going to establish a rift that, really you own between you and the people that you love. So I think that a utopianism is not a story in which nothing goes wrong. I don't think that assuming nothing goes wrong makes you an optimist. I think it makes you an asshole, right? The assumption that nothing could possibly go wrong is what led engineers to decide that they didn't need any lifeboats on the Titanic, right? Planning for things going wrong and trying to figure out a graceful way to fail, that makes you someone who is responsible and prudent. And writing stories in which people have profound disagreements about how to take care of one another is a utopian act that nevertheless has enormous scope for drama and tension and stakes that are as big and bigger and more honest and less of a libel against the human condition than the idea that when the lights go out, your neighbors are coming for you. There's actually a name for that belief that Solnit surfaces, although she didn't coin it. It's a sociological phenomenon called elite panic. And it's the absolute bedrock conviction among wealthy people that because if the tables were turned, they would come and eat their social betters, that when things go wrong, that surely the guillotines will start appearing on their lawn. And they're the ones whose neighbors come over with covered dishes, who greet those neighbors with shotguns. So I do a lot of activism that is not fictional. I write a lot of nonfiction. I do a lot of real world activist stuff. I've worked with an NGO, a digital human rights group called the Electronic Frontier Foundation for 20 years and 2 months now. I just had my 20th anniversary there. And in that work, I am often discussing incredibly abstract ideas that have all the hallmarks of something that can lead us terribly, terribly astray. These are ideas where there's a lot of salience, right? It really matters how we, organize our digital lives. The internet is not like a glorified video on demand service or a jihadi radicalization tool or like the world's greatest pornography distribution tool. It's, it's a single wire that delivers free speech and a free press and free assembly and access to romance and education and politics and, all the things that we care about in a good and just world, and how we organize it is really, really important. And yet the technical details of that stuff are eyes glaze over dull. And so it is the kind of thing where by the time people actually sit up and realize that stuff has gone horribly wrong, it's too late, because if you wait till it's concrete, then you will have passed the point of no return. And this is where fiction comes in. Fiction is another way of presenting the argument, an intensely complementary way to presenting the abstract argument. It's a kind of emotional fly-through of what the lived experience is of getting it wrong. And it wakes people up to this stuff. And sometimes that takes the form of real fiction. I wrote a novella called Unauthorized Bread about what would happen if the appliances in your kitchen worked like inkjet printers and demanded, your toaster demanded that you had to use bread that was authorized by the toaster company. But a lot of the times it takes the form of some of the stuff that my co-panelists have talked about, this design fiction, diegetic work. So a couple of years ago, we produced a thing called the Catalog of Missing Devices, which is like a SkyMall catalog of gadgets that no one's allowed to make because a law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act felonizes reverse engineering certain kinds of devices and improving on them. So we had all kinds of things like, hearing aids and insulin pumps and all kinds of interesting stuff in there. And then, I've got a project that's about to drop. We don't have a good title for you. Our internal title for it is Interoperable Facebook, because there's these laws in Europe and the US, the Digital Markets Act and the Access Act. The European one's like about to pass. The American one is still up in the air, but they're going to require Facebook and other big tech companies to allow third parties to plug new services into them. So if you think Mark Zuckerberg is not a good steward of like how people should conduct themselves, but you find yourself stuck on Facebook because convincing everyone to leave and go somewhere else is a collective action problem you cannot solve, you can kind of have the best of both worlds. You can go somewhere else onto a platform run by someone you trust more than Mark Zuckerberg, someone who is accountable to you, but you can exchange messages with those people on Facebook. And one of the things that I found when the Digital Markets Act was progressing, I had all these mornings where I got up at 4 a.m. to get on a call or a panel with these European bureaucrats, is that they literally couldn't imagine it. They literally just, like, when they tried to imagine interoperable Facebook, it was like trying to imagine having 6 legs or something, or eyes in the back of your head, or what if up was down, or what if 2 was 3, like it did not compute. And so we basically built a tutorial for how to use an interoperable Facebook that doesn't exist, and we're about to ship that. And we're hoping that these lawmakers who really do want to curb the power of Mark Zuckerberg and other big tech executives who are, not super geniuses, not even evil super geniuses, they're just like ordinary mediocrities, no better or worse than you and me. But, the difference is that they've appointed themselves social media czar of 3 billion people. That as these lawmakers and policymakers who want to do the right thing, as their imaginations are informed by some concrete fly-throughs of what it is they could demand of these firms, what's technologically and socially possible, that it can shift the debate in this really profound way that just arguing about policy couldn't. So I guess that's the close of my remarks there. I appreciate this opportunity to talk to all of you and to be on a panel with such interesting folks doing such interesting stuff. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Corey. And yeah, the questions are flying within the chat. Please keep those coming, folks. And there's also some book recommendations where, keep those coming too. I'm going to just mention one because this will be lost to posterity if I don't. That another relevant Rebecca Solnit read alongside A Paradise Built in Hell is Hope in the Dark, which is, I think would be sort of probably week 1 of the creative activist curriculum. All right, so wow, there's a lot of putting my moderator hat back on here. There's a really rich brew for us to investigate here. But Terry, I'd love to start with you and something you said that really leapt out at me about world building as an ancestral practice. And I wondered if you could tell us the story of how you came to it as a practice and what kind of hazards and maybe benefits, but like what have the challenges been fashioning yourself and your work in that mold?
Yeah, thank you. This is the question. How I came to world building myself. One, I'm a huge comic book fan. I've been collecting comics since I was 5. So that's literally how I came to understanding it. And I didn't have that language then, but like I'm totally into sci-fi, totally into comics, self-described nerd forever. And when I started to discover folks who was using the term world building and writing, where I think I first started seeing, things about George Lucas doing the World Bible for Star Wars and things like that, those in popular media that started to be explored, it really gave me access to like, oh, this is stuff I was used to and doing, applying it. Then more recently, I would say folks who I met, who Adrienne Marie Brown, probably know a lot, took at the time when her and other comrades had developed Octavia's Brood, and they had developed a workshop where they was helping people use world building for direct action. And I was also a direct action trainer myself. And for me, that was like, oh, this is my two worlds like coming together. And that helped us kind of adapt and create our world building methodology for organizing as well. And grabbing for those 2 areas is where we start putting together what we do, how we use it as a methodology. It really started coming together more formally too, when we developed, I know in some of the Instagram posts for this event, they had showed a project of ours, Intelligent Mischief, called Black Body Survival Guide. And that was a world we was developing that was a satirical multimedia project about how to be Black and dealing with racism. We were not making progress on that project until we started to use world building. And actually that project created Nation X, because the world building, Nation X was originally the world building for Black Body Survival Guide, and Nation X became its own product. This question is interesting when you said what's with the language you just used, but like what's
the hazards.
Hazards.
About the difficulties in a way that one confronts in trying to do this work in an activist mold.
The hazards of world building itself in trying to use this, or the hazards you use world building
the difficulties in bringing this stuff to life, or another way at it, given the topic of our conversation is, what are the difficulties of utopia?
Okay. I was like, okay, because I was like, it's been wonderful using world building. I haven't experienced any hazards in that. um, but I would say that some of the difficulty. So for us, right, I think a couple of things. We share a similar vision that C4A has about utopia as like it's a roadmap, right? I don't believe, similar to a Cory Doctorow, I don't believe in a place that what we would consider perfect. Actually, when we developed Nation X, the characters, the Brew Hexes that I showed, we originally didn't have the Brew Hexes when we create them. As we was talking about them more, I created the characters, the Brew Hexes, because I thought it was necessary. I wanted a world where people had this utopia, which is Nation X, had differences, and that those differences were built into the system. It was okay. And I want people to have examples of like, we could have major arguments and disagreements. We don't even have to be in the same org or the same thing to be moving towards the same goal. It's all right, right? Like that's what ideally for me a movement that's healthy and functioning would look like. And that was the reason I developed those characters. And people, when they fall into the world Nation X, they really love those characters in particular. I think some of it's because those characters operate outside the system. So it also shows how we as a movement see ourselves, right? But I thought that was very important that this utopia had differences and that those differences were shown and was prominent in the storyline of it. So that to me, I think this with the danger, we operate in the world post Nazi Germany, post different various dictatorships, where people often use, where I think the term utopia was used, right? And that we have like a lot of fears and worries about like, oh no, we can't. Before that, utopia was something that was commonly used a lot historically. I don't know how much of resistance there was, but definitely post this world of these world events happening, right? We have more, I would say, healthy, critical stance towards what the idea of utopia, but that I think is not supposed to be that, right? It doesn't mean that it has to end up in like, oh, once someone says utopia, and this is dominant in popular media, once someone uses utopia, that's really like, oh, you know who the real villain is, right? Coming out.
It's definitely a word and a practice with a lot of baggage, but I think your point is very well taken that even in aspiring, we're not aiming for perfection. It's still a recognizably human, complicated set of worlds that we're talking about. Cory, I wondered if I was going to sort of ask a symmetrical question about your origin story, but maybe a tighter way to ask is there a particular moment in your background where you connected your vocation as a storyteller, a pulp writer, or a maker of worlds on the page, and the activism in the real world that you described to us?
I grew up in an extremely specific milieu that is the closest I think the world has ever come to having a formal apprenticeship for science fiction writers. And it was because of one person, a woman named Judith Merrill, who was a great feminist writer and critic and editor, and who was explicitly political in her science fiction. And as a consequence, there was just like never a strong line between it. I was raised by political activists as well, and that's how I actually came to know Judy before I knew her as a writer. So Judy went into self-exile from the United States and moved to Canada in '68 after the Chicago police riots, and took her kids. She and the science fiction writer Frederick Pohl had split before that, and she took their library to Toronto and she donated it to the Toronto Public Library System, where it became what was then called the Spaced Out Library and is now called the Merrill Collection. It's the largest public science fiction reference collection in the world. And when I was a kid, I used to see Judy on TV introducing Doctor Who on public television every week. And my dad, who knew her from Marxist organizing circles, we would sit down and watch TV together. And Judy would be like, let me tell you about how this trope in Doctor Who was invented around a spaghetti dinner with Isaac Asimov and Fred Pohl at the Futurian House in New York in 1937, and we were drinking too much Chianti, and it was great, right? And then when I was about 9 or 10 years old, we took a school trip to her library where she was the writer in residence, and she said, if you have any fiction and you can make it downtown to Spadina and Bloor where the library is, just bring it along and I'll critique it for you. So this towering figure of the industry and of the field offered to critique 10-year-olds fiction, which I then duly took her up on. Judy also founded a movable feast called Hydra, which was a every 8-week gathering for writers and critics and editors and people who worked in TV and film and whatever. And I was a science fiction bookseller at the time and selling a few short stories. I was a bookseller in the oldest science fiction bookstore in the world, Baca, which was founded by a local fan when Judy told him to. And so I would go to these gatherings, and Judy would be there presiding over it like a grand old doyen. And so, really, I was lucky to have this mentor who was part of this milieu that was like explicitly political and also science fictional, also concerned with science fiction.
Right.
And there was just never any question that this was how my work would be.
Yeah, I particularly appreciate the sort of reminder embedded in that all of these imaginaries themselves have histories.
Oh yeah.
And there are specific
in living
moments around
memory.
specific, right.
Yeah,
Right.
like there are actually people alive who remember, oh, well, we all had this great idea. We're going to write 6 different takes on it. We're all going to get on the B train and go to the fascist John W. Campbell's office at 2 a.m. and throw it over the transom so he can publish all 6 different takes on this one trope that we invented while drunk last night in the next issue of Astounding, right? Like there are literally people alive today, not many left, but some who were part of that.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's become probably a lot more diffuse and kind of harder to trace in some ways than it may have been at the height of some of those moments. But okay, I'm going to turn to questions from our participants here. So let's begin with a question, and I'm going to put this to both of you. Lauren says, do you have specific tools or methods that you recommend for transitioning from world building and speculation, radical imagining of different possible futures, into practical planning toward those imagined futures? And I'm just reading the faces here. Terry, do you want to start?
I would say just do it, take from Nike.
Okay, but elaborate. How?
There's not much more to elaborate on. And I'm being kind of, I would say for, our workshops, right, what we do is have people go through like an imagining process, right? But within that, we also ask them, when you're in that world, create something, right? Like what's something you're creating something when you're imagining. Now grab something from that world, and then we're going to see how can we make it real, right? So it really begins with your imagination and the belief that you can do it. And then you're just practically walking back. You're walking back like, how could this thing be real? If I could imagine it, then how could this object or process thing, right? It's no different from, I know people look for a very particular tool, but like if you have someone who's a sculptor, right? They could say like, hey, it's no tools that we all have access to, right? You have a chisel, you have a hammer, you have these things. You need to imagine what that block of stone's gonna look like, and then you walk back. Like, how did I chisel out that feature? How did I do that? That's the roadmap. So you just need your roadmap, your imagination, and then you walk back to the tools that you have at hand, right? To map it out. So it's gonna be the same. It's gonna be the same planning process. It's gonna be some butcher paper. It's gonna be some pen, pencil. It's gonna be like whatever, things that you actually need when you make out your plan. But the important thing is like, what's your vision, and then walk back. Right, your vision to like make reality.
Yeah, thank you, Corey.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always smart to learn from your enemies. And so one of the worst people in human history is a guy named Milton Friedman, and one of his best ideas was the notion of ideas lying around.
Right.
So Friedman, he was the architect of the Chicago School of Economics. He helped Pinochet murder 40,000 dissidents in Chile, and he changed the way that our world works. He changed the way we think about the role of the state, the role of corporations, and so on. And Friedman, his whole, he was a crank, and he was correctly considered a crank for the first 3/4 of his career. People just thought he was like a nut job. If you remember, like, say, Ross Perot, like in that kind of grade of like cranky old weird grandpa with strange ideas, basically like a crypto bro before suddenly they became mainstream. People who just wanted to talk to you about the gold standard. And Friedman was like, we just need to tell the story. We just need to have the ideas. We just need to like talk to people about this all the time. And then there will come a crisis, and people will go, what do we do? Our old ideas stopped working. And he'll say, they'll look for whatever ideas are lying around, and they'll grab the ideas that are lying around. And so, I feel like, well, I've spent 20 years fighting for people to have more control over their computers, not less. And like, I'm here to tell you, I failed, right? We are now living in an era in which seizing the means of computation is harder than it's ever been and more urgent, but also more popular, right? Like we are really at this moment where people have figured out that there's a problem, and people I profoundly disagree with have figured out that there's a problem. Elon Musk has figured out that there's a problem with how this stuff works. And if you have ideas lying around when the crisis hits, because the good thing about failing to avert a crisis as through your activism is that eventually there will be a rupture, right? Like if you don't do anything about a problem that is real, then eventually the problem will be really real and like will be manifest and can no longer be ignored. Smoke a pack a day long enough and you'll eventually get stage 4 lung cancer. And the question is, at that point, do you turn to nihilism? Do you say, well, it's too late to quit now, right? There's only one rhino left. We might as well find out what he tastes like. Or do we actually like try to do something about it? I think if you've got ideas lying around, right? If people have the model, if they have the story, if they have the world that could be better, that's when you get to make your case, right? I mean, the world we're in was won by people who had that theory. It may not work every time. I might be wrong, but we know it worked once, and yeah, they had the backing of some extremely wealthy, powerful sociopaths, right? But they have the money, we have the people. And so maybe if we can capture some popular imagination, we can get people to think differently about this stuff.
Right. And the array of strategies that we've been talking about throughout this conversation, ranging from an online game like Nation X to a science fiction story, to artifacts from the future that are made available to people, whether in workshops or in their mailboxes or a proposition like interoperable Facebook. These are all ways of making those ideas lie around more legibly and more availably, and thereby kind of inviting them to be taken up when the moment arrives, whenever it arrives. So there's a question here. We only have a few minutes left, but there's a question here for you, Terry, from Max. And it is, can you elaborate on how Black utopia connects to or differs from various political traditions like Marxism, anarchism, or liberalism? I mean, if you think of things in terms of that landscape, how do you picture it?
Yeah, Black utopia is a concept and an idea and a vision. So which should not be confused as an ideology unto itself. So there's many utopias, right? So there's many Black Marxists, Black anarchists, Black socialists, so on and so forth, who have imagined utopias. So that's the easiest way. It's just like, it doesn't have to be, it's not an ideology in and of itself. So any systems of thinking and visioning for the future can be used as utopia.
Thank you. And there's a question here from Mimi, which I'll direct to you, Corey, about how the idea of accepting utopia as no place in reality affects activism versus a commitment to making the impossible possible. So I guess there's a question here about the sort of the categories that we're using to describe these worlds. As someone who's been walking that line, sounds like deliberately and knowingly for a really long time, how do you think about that?
So there's this idea of intuition pumps that, like, when you're in a crisis, when you have to act very quickly and you don't have time to think, that whatever it is you've rehearsed, either mentally or literally, is the thing you're most likely to do, right? This is kind of the theory of ideas lying around. And it's why we have like fire drills, right? Because we can do it. And maybe why we have like certain kinds of panic or anxiety where we just in our minds over and over again go like, what if someone broke into my house and came into my kid's room? What would I do? Right? And you just can't get that thought out of your mind because there's some sense that if you rehearse it long enough, you'll be prepared. It's, kind of grasping for an answer. And I think that pulp writers, when they do the person versus nature versus person story, they give people an intuition pump that when things break down, which they will, not in a dystopian way, but just because like entropy is a thing and complex systems have failure modes that can't be predicted. So when things go wrong, which they will, they're going to assume that it is time for the war of all against all. And I think that there's another intuition pump that we can put into people's imagination, right? We can put the intuition pump of decency and solidarity into people's imagination. And so, you know, when I try to translate the idea of utopianism into like things that people do, what I'm really trying to do is impress on them a theory of action, that what a good person does when things go wrong is leaps to the aid of other people. You know, not in that, like, I don't know if anyone else grew up on the cozy apocalypses, John Wyndham and Neville Shute and so on. You know, these books that were written by these upper middle class British writers after World War II, when the proles entered the public space, that are always about some kind of catastrophe, nuclear war, or like huge man-eating plants, or, you know, whatever, that arrive and, you know, sweep the proles away. And that the only solidarity to be found in these books is all the good middle class people, plus some attractive young proletarian ladies, inevitably, are gathered together behind some kind of fortress wall to fight off both the alien invader and the roving gangs of proletarians, right? And to tell a different kind of story where actually what the hero of the story does is tries to organize everyone and tries to be part of an organization of everyone that bands together for mutual aid, I think really does affect what we do, right? People our whole intuition, our whole thinking about stuff is informed by our fiction. You know, I wrote an article called "The Rent's Too Damn High" about the problems of commodifying housing. And someone came along in the comments and said, well, but you have to understand that even in the caveman days, if you didn't pull your weight, you got kicked out of the cave. I'm like, what is your source for what happened? You know that like Clan of the Cave Bear wasn't a documentary, right? Like the Flintstones is not a memoir, right? And people are just like have these weird ironclad convictions about what we did in the caves. And you know, Graeber and his last book, Graeber and Wengrow's last book, Rise of Everything, Dawn of Everything, is such an amazing debunking of this, and it's so important and so good. But you know, we have to change people's intuition pumps. We have to make people stop thinking that the like evolutionary history of the hominid is these thousands of years of kicking freeloaders out of caves. It's just a you know, nonsense, but it has real consequences.
Well, and another kind of heuristic of hope there, in a way, you know, the priming people to think about what a good person does when the shit hits the fan, and to see themselves as people who are empowered and able to take those steps of mutual aid. It occurs to me that earlier question about tools or approaches to do what Terry said, you know, sort of work your way backward from the block of marble to the finished sculpture. There are processes in the futures world called the backcasting that attempt to get at that. And in particular, there's one that, and this taking a leaf out of Corey's book, you know, Learning from Our Enemies, there's a process called Three Horizons that I think was initially incubated at McKinsey, but that can and is being used for much more humanistic and grassroots community purposes to kind of unpack what is entailed in moving from the state we are in, Horizon 1, to the state we want to be in, Horizon 3, via the transitional strategies of Horizon 2. And, you know, that's a way of unpacking that conversation and becoming a little more perhaps deliberate about what those next steps might be. It's very intuitive in a way, but you can sum it all up as you did, Terry, in just do it. So, look, I would
add to that real
please.
quick. Like you say, the along those lines, there are design thinking tools actually help people ideate a lot in that. So if you just look up design thinking tools, and that we use as well.
Yes, there's a thriving sort of set of practices at the intersections of design and futures work, which I invite people to check out if they haven't had a chance to. But look, we're just scratching the surface here, but what a terrific conversation and privilege to hear from you both. Terry Marshall, Cory Doctorow, thank you so much for being here to discuss the power of utopia. I'm Stuart Candy, that's my bit, and I'm handing it back to Mariam Kazim to take us out.
Thank you to everyone. That was such an amazing conversation, and so many nuggets that we're really excited. And we're going to copy the chat and kind of collate all of the resources and share that with everyone who attended. So don't worry, you'll be able to get all of those resources. I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca, our co-founder, for our closing.
Yes, hi, I'm Rebecca Bray. I'm a co-director of the Center for Artistic Activism, and thank you, Stuart, Terry, and Corey. That was amazing and really such an excellent manifestation of what we were setting out to do when we started this monthly series, Revolutionizing Activism. We really wanted to share amazing people who are truly revolutionizing what activism looks like, and this is wonderful, so thank you. As many of you know, we at the center do a lot of workshops and trainings. We bring utopia into those spaces. We are helping voting groups across the US or people working on the freedom to vote in the US throughout this year. We're working on climate change with Greenpeace and lots of other examples. So if you know a group that you think could use this kind of work, please let us know. We might be able to help them. We also, as researchers, we're always looking at, okay, so these ideas are wonderful, but how do we know that they work in terms of really making change? And I think we touched on that today, but I wanted to let you know that our next session of Revolutionizing Activism will be all about that. It'll be looking at how do we measure effectiveness? How do we think about effectiveness when we're combining these spaces of art and activism and these very different ways of measuring affect and effect? So I really encourage you to come to that. I think, Miriam, we're going to send a follow-up email to people with some details about the dates and everything on that?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great.
It's on
So
May 26th, but
May 26th. So mark your calendars. It'll probably be around this time, but do get on our mailing list so you can hear about that and many other great things like that. We also wanted to remind you about the book giveaway, right? The book, I want to mention, does have a lot on utopia and a lot on that really furthers the conversation that we've started here today. So whether you win the book giveaway or not, do get a copy of it if you don't have it already. But the way that you can do the book giveaway is that you can tag us on a post on Instagram or Twitter. So get on our newsletter, come to the next session, do the book giveaway stuff on social media. We'll also send you an invite to the salon, which is a place where we are continuing conversations with awesome people like you who care about this stuff. And so it's an online forum. Please do join and take part in that. And we also wanted to ask, if you like what you heard here, please support it. We offer this for free. We have some generous donors like you see here on the screen, but we also, in order to continue things like this, we are a nonprofit that relies on donations. So if you're able to afford to throw a couple dollars towards it, it'll really help us to get more amazing stuff like this out to more people. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you all so much for being here, and we hope to see you again next time.